Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Everything's fine then. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation and the opportunity to reopen for myself. It's been a while that I've been immersed in this issue of the dialogue of the deaf, as Mark Sinclair put it yesterday, between Bergson and Einstein. So it's an opportunity to prolong certain intuitions, to maybe rephrase certain ideas, which I already expounded pretty much in different contexts. So I thought it was appropriate for the present circumstances to offer something of a toolkit addressed primarily addressed to physicists. So I'm not sure how many physicists we have in our audience today, but my hunch is that it may be useful for some philosophers as well. And the idea of the toolkit, of course, is in a way suggested by the witty title of Mark Sinclair's opening lecture. Remember, Time for Philosophy. So as he explained quite well, it can be understood in two different ways. So first, of course, obviously it points to what is specific about the way philosophers address the issue of time for philosophers, if you like. And then there's the feeling that in view of the diversity and complexity involved in the scientific representation of time, some kind of philosophical assessment of the overall situation is in order, that it is time for philosophy once again. Okay, now besides these two obvious meanings, I think there's a third one, which in my view is more straightforward and a little distressing too. So let me explain this. Basically, I would put it this way: physicists mostly don't have the time. I mean, they don't have the time, simply don't have the time or the patience for philosophy. It's as simple as that. So you could explain it in institutional, sociological terms. Things have been evolving in the past century. I mean, the situation is fairly different from what is illustrated, well, typically by Bergson-Einstein's exchange, the way it was followed, intensely followed by both physicists and philosophers. There's absolutely nothing equivalent today regarding, for example, conceptual issues, fundamental issues pertaining to research into quantum gravity, let's say. So there's nothing comparable to the amount of philosophical engagement of the profession in the early 20th century. And so again, there are many reasons for that, but the bottom line is that physicists mostly don't have the time, whereas philosophers are generally paid for that. I mean, for researching fundamental issues and kind of rephrasing things at a conceptual level. They do have the time for that. It is their business. And this discrepancy or asymmetry, if you like, in a way is perfectly illustrated by even the most philosophical attempts at popularizing certain ideas of contemporary science. So here I have in mind Carlo Rovelli's popular science books. Mark alluded to some of them yesterday. And what is striking to me is that even for example, in his introductory text to the volume edited by our Italian friends about the Bergson-Einstein quarrel 1 century later, even in that particular text, which is supposed to be a kind of response to the contributors, it is quite clear that he didn't have the time to engage not only with Bergson's actual works, but with most of the papers collected in the volume. So I find this typical. So for example, an indication of this is that what he has to say about Bergson duration in relation to relativity theory would in fact equally apply to Husserl, Kant, Aristotle for that matter. So what I mean is that there's nothing specific about Bergson, nothing specifically Bergsonian about the claims that Rovelli discusses regarding the compatibility or non-compatibility between the phenomenology of time and the scientific perspective. So the very concept of duration in Bergson's sense is barely mentioned. And when it is, and this is a general rule. I mean, Rovelli is just an example. There would be many instances of the same tendency. When it is mentioned, duration, it is systematically conflated with the rather vague notion of subjective time, contrasted with clock time. Again, this is not specific to Rovelli, and I'm just mentioning that particular example because it's the most recent one I was confronted with. The Bergson-Einstein controversy has generally been framed in terms of, you may say, a variation on the two cultures gap. The assumption being that Bergson, as many others, sided with subjective time, felt or lived time, as if that time, subjective, lived, felt, experienced, needed somehow to be defended against the tendentially reductionist threat of, let's say, scientific reconstructions of objective time. So the caricature here would be lived time on the one hand, clock time on the other, the human perspective on the one hand, and on the other hand, something like a cold or dehumanized version of time provided by technoscience. And Bergson would fit on the first, on the first side, the left side, if you like, of the spectrum, trying to make a case, if you like, for what? The relevance, not only the relevance, but more fundamentally, the primacy of, or the originary nature, as a phenomenologist would put it, of experienced time. So I would like to argue once again, because I've done this in many instances, that this way of framing the debate is absolutely missing the point, that something else more important, more relevant is at issue. And in fact, the main issue was clearly indicated by Bergson himself in the very title of his 1922 essay, Duration and Simultaneity. We have to take this seriously. Titles are not chosen by chance or by mere fancy. They are meant in each case in Bergson's works to highlight or rather point in the direction where a genuine problem can be identified and worked out. So here it is basically the issue of coexistence. Coexistence or simultaneity in space and time, and of course that's Bergson's most important claim, essentially in time. Simultaneity is essentially a temporal concept. I think this is the new idea that is put forth by Bergson and elaborated in that book, that simultaneity should be taken seriously as a temporal concept, not as a essentially spatial concept or something only derivatively related to time. It is an essential feature, an essential dimension of temporal experience. So again, simultaneity is not mere juxtaposition in space. It cannot be reduced to non-causal relations of simultaneity holding between distant point-like events laid out on instantaneous slices of the universe, as is commonly defined by the physicists. Simultaneity is a specific mode of being together in time. Hence, a specific mode of sharing a common time in some sense. A common time in some sense, a sense which of course remains to be spelled out. That's the whole challenge in the book. So, as you may realize, central in that respect is the famous twin paradox. Because it involves directly, it actually dramatizes the coexistence of two twins who are separated and united again. So it is absolutely central in that respect, as much as is central Bergson's infamous mistake regarding the possibility of contesting, as it is, the most obvious logical and empirical implication of the paradox, which is that, according to Einstein and relativity theory, the two twins do not age in the same way, and that the traveling twin, upon coming back, will have aged less than the stay-at-home. So it is true that Bergson was involved in committing the fallacy of making a case for the equal amount of elapsed time, thus dissolving the apparent paradox in his own way. that, I should say from the outset, is a mistake, if you like to use the term, or a fallacy. In any case, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't address the core issue behind the paradox. At least the way it has been dramatized by Bergson himself has not proved efficient, and has caused, as you know, many rather boring exchanges between philosophers and physicists, because after a while, physicists keep repeating themselves for a reason. They have a point, and Bergson stubbornly resisted, and at some point just dropped the case, as you know. So I would not come back to these historical circumstances and the detail of Bergson's stubborn insistence upon upholding a seemingly alternative view of Langevin's famous twin paradox. I will leave that aside in order to go for the deeper underlying philosophical issues, which have to do again with the very notion of coexistence. So I want to make a case for that. And in order to properly understand what is at stake here, I think it is crucial to remember, just to realize, in fact, what motivates, for example, something that is essential in his whole argument. What motivates, for example, Bergson's suggestion that we focus on the simultaneity of flows rather than on the simultaneity of instants, the kind of simultaneity which I referred to earlier, namely a set of point-like events laid out upon a slice of instantaneous, an instantaneous slice of the universe, if you like. Okay, you get the image. It's commonly introduced in almost all introductory manuals to the special relativity. So instead of that kind of simultaneity, you think of simultaneity as a simultaneity of flows. How does it change the perspective? Well, for one thing, it helps us get a better grasp of Bergson's issues with the so-called eternalist representation of becoming or change within the block universe, the so-called block universe, the 4D space-time block where all events are virtually laid out and available for inspection in one piece, if you like. If you think in terms of a simultaneity of flows, if you take the notion of flow seriously, well, you realize that Bergson's issues with those eternalist similes or images is not purely formal. I mean, his criticism is not limited, as some have argued, to criticizing the abuse of metaphors or the reification, as it is, of geometrical representational methods such as space-time diagrams. It goes deeper, it goes further. It touches on a more fundamental question, which is the dynamic and essentially relational nature of the universe in which all processes are ultimately embedded. Even those processes which physics describes as approximately isolated systems, as the evolution of quasi-isolated systems, even those are ultimately embedded in a single whole, where things not only coexist in an abstract way, in the way point-like events coexist across space or space-time for that matter, but where actual process, dynamical processes, flows of duration enjoy relations of coexistence as flows, not in terms of a correlation of instantaneous cuts or point events across space. So this is one thing I wanted to highlight, and I will come back to it in a more systematic fashion in a while. On the other side of the spectrum, now I'm de-zooming from, or I don't know, I'm zooming from the universe towards local becoming. If we focus on local becomings in the plural, well, here the issue of simultaneity leads us to question, in fact, as Bergson did, or tried to do, the relevance of the technical notion of proper time. Proper time, as introduced by the physicists, is a variety of local time, if you like. It's defined in a way which, and this is, of course, crucial, which is almost entirely disconnected from any pre-existent or natural notion of simultaneity. It's just a measure. It's a kind of parameter time, if you like. Mathematically, it's equivalent to the use of a parameter along a curve to express various magnitudes. Okay, so proper time, confined as it is to lines of becomings. I'm not saying flows here. Lines of becomings, as defined by the physicists, are of course an issue, a problem which needs to be taken up if we want to make proper sense of the simultaneity of flows. So one issue that Bergson was confronted with at this local scale was to kind of escape the maneuver by which physicists want to force the philosopher into, well, adopting the notion of proper time as the proper mathematical equivalent of lived duration. That's an issue that Bergson was struggling with. So I'm just hinting at all these particular questions just to give a sense of the, well, first the richness and the possible fecundity of Bergson's confrontation with Einstein beyond the most obvious terms of the quarrel, beyond the obvious mistakes or misunderstandings. There is a host, an array of particular issues which more or less revolve around the question of coexistence in space and, more importantly, in time. So just to close this parenthesis about proper time, I will come back to it in a while. It may be a very useful mathematical device, and it is from a scientific perspective, but it is philosophically a very dubious concept if we think we can build up everything from it, you know, in a kind of a bottom-up elaboration or construction of a kind of consistent temporal framework. It is very problematic for reasons that we shall see shortly. So, but the bottom line is, philosophers, if they're of any use, and I don't think philosophers are very useful, generally speaking, but if they are of any use, it is to give physicists a little help in, digesting what is at stake here. This may be perceived as a mark of arrogance on my part. I mean, it's really not. On the contrary, I believe that what betrays philosophical arrogance is to withhold information by assuming that certain philosophical subtleties should be transparent to everyone with a sound mind. It's not the case. I mean, some of these subtleties are hidden in Bergson's text. They need to be worked out. There's a hermeneutics implied in reading Bergson, as any Bergsonian knows. And the least we could do is kind of format this in a way that is accessible and digestible for non-philosophers and especially for physicists. So giving physicists a little help doesn't mean lecturing them, but offering tools or toolkits. I suggest this notion of a toolkit that will allow them, or at least those of them who are interested, not all of them are, that will allow them to find their way in an intellectual landscape which is quite dense and rich, and that I suggest would otherwise require several years of continuous personal engagement to be properly processed. Rovelli doesn't have the time, obviously, and most physicists don't. Maybe on retiring, things will be different, but we're not in the situation where someone like Hermann Weyl, for example, or Niels Bohr could actually have a discussion, a serious philosophical discussion about Kant and the implications of idealism. This is not the way things happen today. You may think it's a progress or a pity, but that's the way it is. So whatever you may think of the value, the inherent value of philosophical inquiry, its value for the advancement of knowledge or the acquiring of intellectual virtues, philosophy is not something you can become acquainted with merely by flipping through books once in a while in your spare time, or by picking up nice quotes and nice images. It requires training and exercise. And so to begin with, so that's the first lesson, the first element of the toolkit, which I want to hand out to you. To begin with, I think that one thing that philosophy will teach you, if you make the effort to immerse yourself in the relevant literature, is that time, and here I do this gesture, time, quote unquote, is a rather special concept to be handled with care, as the phrase goes. By this, I mean that it is not, contrary to what may seem, it is not an abstraction obtained from the multifarious experience of becoming. It's not a highly general concept obtained through a process of higher and higher generalizations. That's not how it works. I mean, some philosophers would typically say that it is an a priori concept. Well, precisely, an a priori concept is not something like a very general empirical generalization. It's something totally different. I'm not advocating for the a priori reading of the concept of time. The point is that it is, I take it as an indication that the whole tradition has taken the concept of time as not merely an idea in the mind, something that you can elaborate based on experience, not merely something like an empirical generalization, but as in Kantian terms, as a form of sensibility, or generally speaking, a transcendental condition of phenomenal experience. So I do not wish to go into that. I take it as an indication that there's something special about time. The same is not true for other very general concepts that you will come across in metaphysics. So I think this we should kind of reflect a little bit upon. And Bergson, for one, of course, did not believe that it was necessary to grant time an a priori status. Nevertheless, I would suggest that he handled the concept in a way that is typically metaphysical, and I would say typical of those, I think there's a limited number of them, those concepts which do not work like the ordinary kind of abstractions. So my point is very basic. Whether you think in terms of an ordering of becoming, that would be Plato or Aristotle's notion of time as an order of becoming, a number of motion in Aristotle's terms. Or whether you think in terms of an a priori condition of all sensible experience, Kant, or as, sorry? Okay, let me pursue. So whether you think of it in those terms, or as Bergson did, as a fundamental ontological process underlying all real change, time, in all of these different doctrinal philosophical contexts, is inseparable from a particular perspective on temporal phenomena, a certain way of addressing the problem of becoming. And what is the problem of becoming? So there, you might say there are as many perspectives on the question as there are philosophies, but to give you a sense of what is at stake, take Plato's definition of time as the image of eternity in the Timaeus, very famous quote. Time is the image, sorry, the moving image of eternity. So basically what is at stake, if you read the text, is the possibility of a mathematical ordering of what Plato describes as an otherwise unruly and turbulent sensible world. That's quite a specific issue, and that I would, much simplification, I would take as Plato's concept / problem of time. Okay, a particular perspective upon the issue of becoming itself. Now, you may take as another example St. Augustine's interest in the issue of time and temporal experience generally. Very clearly, in the Confessions, it stems from a question regarding our understanding of eternity, but in a quite different way than Plato, in relation with what is distinctly temporal about human experience. So the oft-quoted passage about the elusive passage of time. the fleeting nature of the now has led to much interpretation and commentary, but it is not the most interesting and most singular contribution on the issue of time by Augustine. It's, in fact, you might think of it as a kind of subjective rendering of ideas that were already floated by Aristotle. The most important thing is that time for Augustine is an operator, if you like to use this mathematical analogy, an operator that dramatizes the relation between human existence, the temporal features of human existence, and divine eternity. And what comes with it, the perspective of redemption and salvation and so on and so forth. So if you retain from the Confessions only a blueprint, if you like, for the A conception of time, of the passage of time, the famous A time, well, you've stripped it from, the compound of vital issues that make it something worth reflecting upon, that make Augustine's contribution singular. And the same goes, of course, with Bergson. So generally speaking, I would argue that the first lesson of a philosophical investigation in the nature of time is that, to the extent that the philosophical notion or idea of time has intellectual value, it cannot be thought of as a bare conceptual minimum, some sort of lowest common denominator between, well, the available scientific evidence and the common sense notions attached to temporal experience. It's not a mean, a statistical mean, or a lowest common denominator that would be, presented in conceptual clothing. If you think of time, the philosopher's time, in that way, well, you're pretty much talking about something else. That's not the way it works. So if you prefer, but this is really the same thing. You could say time is not some hyper object out there in the ether of reality. It's not some hyper object that could lend itself to different kinds of inquiries, to different perspectives, so scientific, common sense, logical, phenomenological, etc. The point is, it's not an object at all. Neither hyper, neither super object. It's not an object. The idea of time I take to be essentially formal in nature. By formal, I mean it is part of the very grammar of thought. It is part, as Wittgenstein put it, of the form of representation. It's not part of the scene described. It's not represented as an object out there, even a highly general and elusive object. It's not an object at all. It's not an object, or if you like, a classifying or categorizing tool applying to various aspects of temporal phenomena, trying to express various aspects of temporal phenomena. I would suggest that it has the same degree of generality and the same degree of fluidity, for the same reason, as, say, the concept of information in the scientific domain. So think of this analogy: time, information, same degree of generality, and information is not an object concept. It's a perspective on reality as a whole. You may think of reality in terms of information, just as you can think of reality in terms of becoming or time. You don't have to, but there are reasons that you're, in certain contexts, that you have to. Or think in the domain of metaphysics itself, of the concept of existence. The concept of existence does not apply to any particular object, and so on and so forth. I could give other analogies. At some point, I was interested in comparing time with energy, the physical concept of energy, and think of it in terms of a highly inclusive concept, which is not meant to describe this or that aspect of experience, but which serves as in itself as a perspective upon every evolution, every transformation, every exchange of information, and so on and so forth. So the bottom line is, in that sense, it is utterly misleading to speak of time as a multi-layered concept that one could break into subspecies, or perhaps described in terms of maybe almost homonymous ideas corresponding to widely different aspects or dimensions of temporal experience. If you start thinking in those terms, everything is lost. So Rovelli, for example, sorry, I'm not. This is not a. I don't have anything personal against Carlo, which I very much appreciate as a colleague, and which I have also invited to some of my own conferences. But Rovelli, for example, suggests that there is, and Mark commented upon that, as many concepts of time maybe as there are levels at which you can approach it, as there are perspectives on it. So neuroscience, phenomenology, physics, cosmology, etc. And in the same way, you could be tempted to bifurcate from the outset, to bifurcate the concept of time into what measured time on the one hand and lived time. I've already alluded to that. So the time of clocks and the time of consciousness, etc. And well, yes, obviously there are aspects out there which do not easily fit together and which you would be tempted to describe as belonging or pertaining either to subjective time or objective time. But is it the best way to approach the issue? Pretty much any concept, and certainly any philosophical concept, can be submitted to such an analytic treatment, seriating, differentiating and seriating various species, subspecies, and maybe coming to a point where the concept of time becomes homonymous, so we're not really dealing with the same thing or the same problem. Yeah, that may be, and this kind of method is a rhetorical method, is a basic trick that one applies in philosophical essays. But in this particular case, the rhetoric of homonymy, as I would call it, the pluralization of time into different domains or layers of meaning, is not only unhelpful, I think it is profoundly misleading, because it fosters the idea that time is really, at the end of the day, a blanket word for a host of local conceptual schemes, and that the best you can hope from philosophical reflection is to achieve what? Some sort of general ordering or classification at the most abstract level. And the reason I put it in this way is Bergson was utterly allergic to that kind of dialectic, this way of conceiving of the proper business of philosophy. He called it dialectic in the kind of verbal, purely rhetorical sense that he despised. And what he suggested instead is under the term intuition, the intuitive method, the method of intuition, is a way of working out concepts that allows you to, well, providing that you make the effort, to go straight, directly at what constitutes the problem, the inherent or underlying problem behind, well, such a notion as time. So if you don't embrace something like Bergson's method, there are other ways to, I would say, to live up to the standard that I'm setting, but Bergson certainly offered an alternative. If you don't do something of that kind, well, you end up with such ridiculously obvious statements as, I quote, there's a famous, it was intended as a pun, of course. I quote, "Time is the easiest way nature has found to prevent everything from happening at once." Okay, time is the easiest way nature has found to prevent everything from happening at once. There's a famous physicist who jokingly introduced this non-definition of time, of course. But you see, the details of the story, the underlying logic, A time, B time, eternalism, presentism, in that respect, only unfold the most tautologous and obvious statements, such as the one I just gave. And most of the time, when you look at it more closely, you realize that those debates regarding A time, B time, eternalism, presentism, and all the variations have nothing specifically temporal about them. I mean, these are debates about the nature of time, allegedly, which turn out to be structurally analogous or homologous to discussions regarding, for example, the proper interpretation of indexical worlds, indexical words, such as now, such as here, such as I, or let's say modal concepts such as the possibility of future events, and so on and so forth. So then we just scrap the surface of things, you realize that these are ontological debates which may be interesting for their own sake, but which could very well be unfolded quite independently from the living and actual, effective and living, vital, I would suggest, issues attached to our understanding of time. And Bergson was very much aware of this. And that is, by the way, one reason he never felt obliged to engage in a discussion with Russell, for example, who about the same time as Bergson had a discussion with Einstein, well, starting to launch a rather abrupt onslaught on Bergsonianism, reproaching Bergson for not understanding the basic logics of temporal experience, and so on and so forth. There was no actual response because Bergson thought that these were irrelevant issues, irrelevant debates. Okay. If philosophy is worth an hour's trouble, I'm quoting from Pascal, well, it should help us not lose sight of what matters. Einstein, I would suggest, now to close these very long introductory remarks, the rest will be more, we'll be reviewing things at a more rapid pace. To close these introductory remarks, I would suggest that Einstein, at least, showed some flair when he affirmed in his blunt answer to Bergson that, well, you may remember this, there is no third time besides physical time and psychological time. There's no time of the philosophers, no time for philosophers. And by this, I gather he meant that there is no super object out there to which philosopher could claim a sort of privileged first-person access. And of course, he was right. I mean, time is not an object laying out there and that you could address or approach either scientifically or phenomenologically or psychologically or metaphysically, as if, you know, these were like various possible perspectives on the same thing. And I believe Bergson could not agree more. Although I think that primarily Einstein's infamous quote was meant as a rebuttal, as a criticism. Okay, so once again, time is not an object; it's a form, and as such, and this is now what I want to show by a series of probings or drillings in Bergson's work. As such, as a form rather than as a highly abstract concept lending itself to various approaches. As such, it connects at the deepest level to a host of a cluster of concepts and problems that are, in fact, the distinct business of metaphysics. More positively, time as form is an essential component of a wider categorical framework that each philosopher has tried to build for itself, a categorical framework according to which one tries to deal with the world as a whole in a consistent way. You know, Wilfrid Sellars at one point suggested that metaphysics is concerned, I quote, with the way things in the most general sense of the world hang together in the most general sense of the world. So I approve this message. The nodal function of time within a categorical framework, well, is confirmed by the way it connects with as many ideas and problems as possible at the deepest, most fundamental level. Ideas such as those of necessity and contingency, actual and virtual. I'm referring to Keith Robinson's paper read yesterday. Persistence and transience, identity and change, and so on and so forth. So on many of these topics, of course, science has nothing straightforward, nothing immediate to contribute. One issue is to actually show that at some level, in certain provinces of scientific inquiry, well, the concepts and problems I've just mentioned and listed become relevant and can in turn be affected, can be transformed or dynamized by new scientific schemes. And this is exactly the way Bergson thought we should address the theory of relativity. Einstein's theories involve, Bergson explicitly said, involve new philosophical intuitions. They actually yield new by themselves. You don't have to interpret them. They yield by themselves a new range of philosophical intuitions, which suggest some improvement of our categorical framework. But the main task for the philosopher, in his view, was to enable those intuitions to come to fruition, to become apparent, and to become workable on condition that we strip them from the layers of common sense scientific metaphysics. This might seem oxymoric, but I am putting those words together on purpose. Common sense scientific metaphysics, or as Louis Althusser said, la métaphysique spontanée des savants, the spontaneous metaphysics of scientists. You have to strip the Einstein's intuition from that kind of metaphysics, typically the block universe view of becoming, in order to recover what is essential and new. So what I'd like to do now for the remaining time, like that's about 20 minutes I have, I guess. Can I count on that? Okay. Is just spell out a few elements of my package, my toolkit, my theoretical toolkit for physicists. The complete toolkit is available online at a discount price. No, I'm just joking. I'll give you the highlights. So first, and I'm just numbering these items, if you like, or the bullet points. First, and I won't be too long here because this, for example, I have explained at length in well, the commentary I gave and the critical edition I put together for duration and simultaneity in French. First, we have to realize that whenever Bergson speaks of real time in the context of the theory of relativity, so in duration and simultaneity, his 1922 books, real time is meant for measured time, not something else, okay? Not some kind of ineffable, lived, felt time. It's measured time, not inner duration, but time lived and measured, lived and effectively measured, as he very often writes. And I would add lived all the more as it is actually effectively measured. There's no contradiction here. So it is truly physical time that is at stake here, as distinct from what he described as purely mathematical time, kind of a symbolic rendition of time or a mathematical artifact that he thinks he can identify in the physical construction, in the structure of physical theory. What is at stake in this distinction between real time and symbolic or mathematical time is finding the locus, the particular locus where the articulation of lived time and constructed and measured time can be clarified by pitting, if you like, measured time against certain features attached to what? The subjective operation of consciousness involved in any act of measurement. So among those features, and this is I think rarely commented upon, there is of course the question, the indexical now, so the moment where the act of measurement takes place. You know that there's a whole literature about the relevance and the centrality of that in quantum mechanics, the so-called problem of measurement and the way it affects our understanding of time and consciousness and physical happenings. But here in the particular context that Bergson is interested in, I would suggest that more importantly than the now, more importantly than the flow itself, there is the fact that time not only passes, the time that we measure not only passes in the sense that it is attached to actual changes, actual physical becomings, but that in so doing, it allows things to persist and to persist through time together, not only as if they were, each of them was alone in the world, so to speak, but together. So there is this sense of things unfolding in parallel, unfolding together in time, which Bergson thinks is an essential component of the very idea of a physical measurement of time. And this, of course, directly affects the way we should interpret, I already alluded to this, the notion of proper time in the sense the physicists take it. So this is my second point. Local time or proper time is both Bergson, this notion, this object, it's a mathematical object, basically, a kind of variety of parameter time, if you like. This object has led Bergson to both one of his major oversights and one of his major intuition. So the oversight is quite clear, and I won't be too long here. So the oversights consist in systematically underestimating the relevance and the centrality of this notion of local or proper time within the structure of special relativity, and most importantly, in the very staging of the twin paradox. I'll come back to the twin paradox, but the point is that he underestimated the structural relevance and importance of proper time, and I would say in a way was misled himself by what you could view as an epistemological obstacle linked to the notion of perspective, the fact that everything seems to be defined in terms of coordinate systems attached to reference frames, and as a result, all mathematical expressions of time would have a kind of perspectival quality attached to them. This allows Bergson to kind of argue for the complete reciprocity of perspectives in the case of the twins. And this, of course, is a mistake. But the reason for that mistake, I don't want to go into the details. The main reason is that he didn't see that the best way to approach the situation of the twins is by completely abstracting from reference frames and dealing with what is actually the coexistence and the parallel unfolding of two proper times. One of them being measured differently owing to the structural metrical properties of Minkowski space-time. So the longest path across space is the shortest in time, to put it shortly. And this is a metric property of proper time, which suffices to explain the paradox in a rather compelling way. And so Bergson, you might say, was clinging to this perspectival notion that all the mathematical expressions of measured time must be interpreted in terms of perspectives or reference frames, as it is. Let's leave that aside. What is the intuition? So the oversight I just stressed. Now the intuitions behind the mistake or the oversight is that, to put a long story short, precisely because that time is local, in this particular technical sense, that it comes down to a parameter measured along so-called space-time curves or space-time path traced across space in time, or word lines, or lines of universe, ligne d'univers in French, Weltlinie, ligne. Again, an ultra-thin notion of time, which kind of unfolds where the action is happening point-wise, from one instant to the next, in a vicinity of space that ideally can be confined to a single point at every moment. So it's a kind of a continuous chain of point-like events tracing a path in space-time, along which, by integration, you calculate, you actually measure and give a numeric expression to the elapsed time. Okay. Bergson's basic intuition, and I think I think you could make a case for it, and I believe most physicists, if you press them, enough, would agree that the problem with that notion of time, that it has nothing specifically temporal about it. We call it time because we know it can be used to make sense of the local measurement of clocks, kind of measuring time where the action takes place. But the fact that there is no inherent natural notion of simultaneity attached to proper time renders it almost useless as far as elaborating a consistent concept or framework of temporal concepts is concerned. You cannot work bottom up from there and recover a consistent, coherent sense of simultaneity unless you introduce additional mathematical devices such as the possibility of correlating again, point-like event at a distance using electromagnetic signaling, for example, or radar methods in order to define planes or hyperplanes as they are of simultaneity, cutting across the unfolding proper times. You can do that and recover a sense of simultaneity, but as you all know, that simultaneity turns out to be relative, okay? Essentially relative, and in that sense, unable to yield a sense of common shared time that is invariant across reference frames. And so I would say the fundamental fact, or the fundamental idea behind relativity theory, which is that there is an essential relativity of elapsed time with respect to space-time path actually taken, with respect to the way things actually move across space, not to be confused with the relativity of time with respect to the arbitrary choice of certain reference frame, okay? This sort of intrinsic relativity of time, if that makes sense, attached to proper time. This fundamental intuition is also the one that ruins any attempt at recovering a sense of shared common time. And of course, Einstein, as many physicists, is perfectly all right with that, okay? So the idea is, well, let's do something else, let's leave aside the Newtonian absolute time and the notion that there would be an absolute now sort of sweeping across the entire universe and enabling you to picture the unfolding process of the universe as a whole, and just focus on the way things interact dynamically based on those inherent metric properties attached to the notion of proper time. So long simultaneity at a distance, there's only relative simultaneity relations, shifting simultaneity relations, and no sense of the common now beyond the here now. That's the ontological conclusion that many philosophers will reach by following Einstein's lead. There's no now beyond the here now. There's no share now, and any sense of share now is an artifact, the product of devising, signaling methods enabling you to define arbitrarily simultaneity relations across space. But those are relative, inherently relative. So nothing intrinsic or invariant there. So let me move on to what? To the twin paradox, basically. So that would be my next step. But in order to introduce the twin paradox properly, I realize I have 5 more minutes, no, not more. I need to say a few things about duration itself, which which so far I have assumed as being, fairly well understood, because most of us here have an interest in Bergson or have read more or less extensively read Bergson. But nevertheless, it's important to realize, and to be able to put forth in a few words what is distinctive about Bergsonian duration once it is agreed, as I've argued, that duration doesn't come down to subjective time or felt time. It's something rather specific that you don't find exactly in the same way in Husserl, for example, or Kant, certainly, for that matter. And it's quite simple. In my toolkit, I could, of course, elaborate a little bit, and if you're interested, we can have a discussion about that. But I would simply suggest that the core, the conceptual core behind the intuition of duration, the intuition is spelled out in French. I mean, in sentences which have a particular syntax, and so, despite Bergson's point that this is not exactly a concept, that it is inseparable from an intuition that you have to effect, for itself each time, well, there is something like a concept of intuition. This is a general form of the intuition of time, which bears the name duration. And it comes down, if you kind of want to spell out the conceptual core, to two basic principles. The first principle is a principle of conservation. It's not obvious at all when you think of flow, duration, transience, passage. It's not about passage. It's about that which does not exactly pass, but is preserved. A principle of conservation or continuation, which allows the past to spill over the present, to continue itself within the present. So there's a sort of a basic adherence of past experience to the now or the present, by which the past, and in that sense, I don't want to go into that, but I mention it in passing, in that sense, the virtual is kind of retained and actively affects what is happening now. So it's not a succession of separate phases of becoming. Each moment of becoming somehow incorporates all previous becoming, all the past of that particular becoming, and kind of is condensed from a particular perspective in the present moment. So there is a sense of inseparability, of continuity of past and present. That's the first principle. I call it a principle of conservation because it means that becoming is not a kind of succession of instantaneous events kind of being stringed together along a temporal dimension. It's nothing of the sort, and that's I think the basic intuition behind Bergson's criticism of all static rendering of becoming, of the model of the line, or the mathematical notion of continuity as being in fact a set of elements. So that's one thing, but the principle wouldn't be of much interest if it was not originally conjoined or coupled with a second principle, which is, as I call it, a principle of variation. And the way it works is that the principle of conservation, by its own working, if you like, translates into a principle of variation. The idea is quite simple to grasp, is that the action of time is to make things change by virtue of being in time. Bergson's hunch is that time is what makes things change by the mere fact of enduring. So, to put it differently, kind of paraphrasing Leibniz principle of indiscernible, the identity of indiscernible, there's no such thing as two perfectly identical moments of time. So even if you're considering the same kind of static, apparently static state, from one instant to the next, if that makes sense, this system, this state is forced to change, to undergo transformation by the mere fact that in between the two moments, some time has elapsed. And as a result, a bigger amount of pastness, if you like, has accumulated and affected, colored the next moment, the next present moment. So there's no way two moments can literally repeat each other. Principle of variation, or I take it as the temporal counterpart of Leibniz's principle of indiscernible. So just conjoin those two principles, and I've tried my best laying it bare in purely conceptual terms. Put them together, find the right illustration, the right I'd say loci of experience where this can where you can give sense, proper sense to that, where these things make sense, and what you get is the intuition of duration. And now, of course, comes an element which is quite rarely emphasized, but which to me is central to the whole discussion with Einstein. And you'll see in my upcoming conclusion about the twin paradox how it is relevant. The point is that besides the principle of conservation and the principle of variation, besides the fact, to sum up, that the past extends over the present, forcing the present to change, the past extends over the present, forcing the present to change. Besides that, there is, if you like, along an axis which you might picture as being orthogonal or perpendicular to the first one, to the axis of flow and transience. In parallel to this, there's the axis of coexistence, layered durations also unfolding in parallel. This is not mere juxtaposition in space. It's not about things happening together in space, because many different durations are scattered across space. What this implies is a process of being together or unfolding together in time, and the way it translates effectively is through a third principle, which is in fact more obscure and elaborated in different ways in Bergson's text, which you could describe as the pressure of the whole, or the universe, you want to call it like this, the pressure of the whole upon each elementary duration, upon each strand of duration. The very coexistence of many duration in more or less proximal, more or less distant relations of simultaneity affects in return every duration. That is the reason why there is no such thing as an absolute isolated mechanical system in the universe. No system is isolated in every respect and at every degree of precision. There are only intimations or approximations of that, and physicists are very well aware of this idealization, which makes them speak of isolated or even quasi-isolated system. No system is isolated, so there's a principle of plenitude or solidarity. Jean Kalevich spoke of organic totalities, but it applies to the universe as such, not only to each particular duration, where the past is kind of inseparable from the present, but at the cosmic level, at the grand scale, at a global scale, there is also such a solidarity. And this is directly relevant. Now I come to my conclusion, which is the last bullet point, if you like, the twin paradox. So I think you could view the twin paradox as a toy model, in fact, of the universe as a whole. It's a way for Bergson to dramatize the basic notion of coexistence through time, coexistence through time, being together in time. One point, which, so I can skip the details because I think Keith Robinson made a good case, reminding us of Milich Čapek's interpretation of Bergson's reading of the paradox. Čapek called it a topological interval. The idea, very simply, I don't want to go into the kind of mathematical underpinnings. It's actually a question of topology, the way things are causally connected across space and time. But in a more, using an image, if you like, I would say that the separation of the twins, the time that elapses in between the two events of their separation and reunion. So I'm just kind of drawing a picture in the air. You've come across this quasi-triangular shape, which is supposed to describe the space-time path of the traveling twin. So separation, reunion, what happens in between? Well, there's literally a shape, a sheaf of simultaneity, which captures at a topological level the sense that despite the discrepancy in measured time across the respective proper times elapsed on each path. So there's the static path of the stay at home, the kinetic path of the traveling twin, but despite the discrepancy in the total elapsed time along each route, there is a fact about their shared simultaneity all along, in between the two events, during the time of the separation, well, there is the sense that they are, in a true sense, contemporaneous. There is a contemporaneity, a simultaneity of coexistence between the twins during the time of their separation. The time is measured differently by each of them, but they share an objective sense of simultaneity, which has a mathematical counterpart, the very interval, and of course, which is essential to Bergson's project of making sense of the way things hang together temporally, not piecemeal, in a piecemeal fashion, things being sort of glued or added together based on kind of an original breaking down of durations into proper times, but directly at you might say, not necessarily at a cosmic or global scale, but at the regional scale, involving a differential of durations between two proximal/distant processes. So the twins are a good case in point. They are together, separated and united again. There is a sense of objective becoming together or coexistence, which, and I believe this is what ultimately Bergson was trying to get at, which should be incorporated from the outset, okay? Otherwise, and it is very apparent in most physical and even philosophical rendering of the basic ideas of Einstein's relativity, otherwise it's almost doomed to be left out of the picture. It's quite rare that people take an interest in the objective sense in which the twins are really contemporaneous. Most people don't pay attention. Most physicists take it as a trivial fact, okay, rooted in the topological underpinnings of Minkowski space-time. But philosophically, it is essential that we introduce this and make it obvious from the outset, and that we work at this kind of intermediary level between local time on the one hand, proper times, and cosmic or universal time on the other. And I will end on this, which is, yes, I totally concur with Mark Sinclair when he emphasizes the fact that it is kind of misleading and in fact incorrect to attribute to Bergson a kind of almost idiosyncratic predilection for so-called absolute time. Certainly not in the Newtonian sense. Like, for one thing, absolute time in the Newtonian sense is mathematical time, okay? I would say what Bergson was really interested in and what he was concerned about is rather universal time, not in the kind of GTM sense of the world, not in the Newtonian sense of absolute time, but literally universal time, and we should keep this in mind for further discussion. Universal time, as discussed by Bergson in that book, is nothing but the time of the universe. The time of the universe as such, the whole material universe as such. And the issue is, how can we account for the fact that despite the ongoing discrepancies in measured physical time, despite the relativity of simultaneity and so on and so forth, something can be recovered of the unity of a global cosmic process, which, and this is even beyond the discussion with Einstein, which Bergson believes affects, in fact, directly affects, or well, more or less directly affects each singular duration. Every duration is, in fact, is brought to produce, to yield even more change, even more novelty by the mere fact of being part of the whole material universe. No duration endures or flows alone. And so I will end here, and thank you for your patience. This was a kind of a hint at the toolkit I would I would put together maybe in a more systematic fashion if I had to address them directly for physicists. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Toruń. And we have first question, so I go directly to Alex.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Sure.
It's the usual sentence in Zoom, apart from, can you see my slides? Okay, it's a pleasure to meet you, Elie. Thank you for your lecture. So I want to gently press you to say maybe a bit more about the claim that current physicists don't have the time, because I think you're being too generous. I mean, I'm a physicist,
okay,
turned neuroscientist and a Bergsonian, as I'll say later on. And I have the feeling that today, physicists and scientists more generally, they don't have the time, that's true, but probably they don't have, I would say, the ability or maybe the temperament or maybe the mindset for philosophy, and certainly they don't have the incentives. Actually, we have the anti-incentives, anything that resembles philosophy, and often philosophy for a scientist is an insult that means too much thinking or too much theory. So like Jimena Canales yesterday, I think the picture is much worse than maybe we want to publicly accept. And so having made that negative comment again, I see very little room for progress in the sense that, let me put it this way, with all my respects, I think this toolkit for physicists, they won't use it and it won't be useful to them, and then therefore we'll continue to have them, I want to say them, it's weird because I'm kind of split, right? Them doing their thing and you or us doing our thing, maybe for another century. so what's I mean, 100 years after the divorce, this fatal divorce, right. Are we going to continue like this 100 more years?
Yeah, you may be right, and yeah, you have a point. I think the situation is quite distressing. My own experience, I've worked for the past 10 or 15 years with physicists intensively. We had a joint seminar at the physics laboratory in Paris, and we had conferences on quantum gravity, on the twin paradox, and so on. There is always a point in the discussion where the physicist loses patience. This is already very well illustrated in the very blunt, very short exchange between Bergson and Einstein. You know, Einstein's answer is so abrupt, almost offensive. Yeah. There are linguistic reasons. He didn't get everything Bergson had to say. And of course, mostly I think the blame should be put on Bergson, because it was a crazy idea to read what he did. He read a few pages of an upcoming book. This is a silly thing to do when you're facing Einstein live, you know, flesh and bones. You could have a discussion, and you know, Bergson was a masterful speaker. He could, you know, lecture for 2 hours without one note. Why did he choose to read, you know, a rather obscure, you know, chapter where the issues were not made very clear, and of course it was in a kind of rather subtle, complicated French prose, which I suppose Einstein couldn't really get. So this being said, the impatience illustrated by Einstein's answer is typical. There's always a point in the discussion, in the conference, where someone will lose patience and say, oh, either this is trivial, let's not lose too much time on this, or this is just wrong. This can't be, you know, like, so. And so it takes time also. So it comes back also to the kind of inherent requirement of conceptual thinking or philosophical or maybe speculative thinking, which Hegel described as a tremendous slowing down of thought. Mathematicians are so quick, they're so fast, you know, they kind of intuit like a chess player the implication of a particular argument, and so this slowing down, which is required by the kind of elaboration of conceptual matter, is it's a matter of, as you said quite well, of temperament ultimately. And the point is that the institutions don't help here. The way humanities and scientific disciplines are split from a very early age. I mean, starting from high school in France, is detrimental, because you end up with two different mindsets, two different types of people, and the sociology of a kind of split intellectual landscape where discussions rarely happen and rarely make progress. So on the one hand, you get philosophers who have a kind of a vague interest for science, but who are not trained enough to do anything but read popular science books. And so they get the wrong images, the wrong ideas, and for no help. And the few physicists who have some time for discussion, for philosophy, I think mostly are not trained for it. They're not prepared for it. So they read philosophy as they would read a novel. It's quite strange the way it's used and referred to as a rather loose level of informal discussion where things can be tried, things can be said, which without too much argument and so on. Yeah, it's a bit distressing. But so one thing I want to hint at is concerning the particular issue of cosmic time and the kind of the notion of coexistence in time, which I think can be recovered from the physical construction and which Bergson had in view. What I find reassuring is, for example, the whole chapter devoted in one of Lee Smolin's book, Time Reborn, which is, by the way, traversed, it's quite striking, by a Bergsonian tone, Bergsonian intuitions, which are never acknowledged because I don't think he has read Bergson. And the few remarks he makes seem to suggest that he has the wrong notion that Bergson is kind of an anti-science guy. You know. Anyway, but the chapter on cosmic time, on cosmological time, is very interesting because he clearly suggests that this object, the universe, the material universe as such, and the way it evolves, the way it may or not imply an evolution of the laws of physics themselves, with a strong sense of indetermination at the fundamental level. Namely, we don't know how they will evolve. There may not be meta laws governing the evolution of laws and so on and so forth. These issues pretty much revolve around the possibility of recovering a sense of togetherness in the way things unfold together at the cosmic level. And there's a very strong charge against the kind of basic relativistic understanding of proper time as kind of bringing the philosophical lesson of an utter disappearance or splitting apart implosion of shared time. This is not so, according to Lee Smolin himself. There is a notion of shared time that we have to look somewhere at the deeper level, cosmological, maybe thermodynamical. Things are not settled. And so the fact that it is at least acknowledged gives me some hope that someday we may have a discussion. But I agree basically with your point. Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks. And we have another question from Krzysztof.
Microphone. Thank you for your speech. I have to admit that I'm not especially familiar with Bergson works, but you mentioned about some important aspects of his concept of duration, which you called principle of preservation.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, is there something in Bergson works about reverse impact? Because the preservation was about that our past is constantly impacts our present and our future. I'm curious, is there something about, say, put it, reverse impact, that our present thoughts, present events could impact our past, like rewriting our memories and history and so on?
Yeah, so there's something that is kind of analogous to what you're describing on the level of memory, the way memory shapes and kind of fixes and then recalls certain memory images. There is an interplay, a back and forth of past and present in the actual elaboration of memories and the way they are put to use to throw light on present action, present activity. So, but at the ontological level, the past is the past. And so there's almost this kind of a fixist notion that the past is preserved in itself. Whatever happened, whatever was the case, is in a way conserved and preserved, not in memory, but in reality. So it's a kind of, Deleuze, I think, described it as an ontological memory, which involves the preservation of the past as a whole. So the question, how memory as a psychological faculty human memory, deals with this preserved kind of indestructible, immemorial past is a different story. And here you could have this kind of reverse effects where the past is actually reframed from, in retrospect, in order to extract adequate information. There's this thing going on, but the ontological background is more or less linear. It's an accumulation of the past upon itself, so you may think of it in terms of the growing block, but I don't think this is very helpful. This is just an image. Okay, you get the growing block. There's no particular implication as to, eternalism or presentism. Basically, eternalism, according to Bergson, is either a non sequitur or just a trivial point. But yes, the past continually grows and accumulates upon itself. And as a result, every new present moment is bound to be different, is bound to introduce something new in the strong sense, and to be slightly, even infinitesimally different from pure repetition or automatic mechanistic repetition of the same process. There's always an inflection, even if it's minimal, owing to the fact that some time has elapsed in between, and that the past has grown little more, and the amount of past that presses against the doors of the present, if you like, is more important. And so that's the basic ontological process. At that level, there's no backward kind of reaction of the present upon the past. And for a deep reason that I haven't really mentioned here, the present, according to Bergson, is nothing, it has no ontological grounding. There is, strongly speaking, only the past. The present itself, when you look at it, is almost entirely informed by the past. It's the sense that you can say that you could grasp the now as a kind of a limit, a moving spotlight, and kind of focus on something that is happening now in the strict sense doesn't even make sense at the phenomenological level, but much less at an ontological level. The present is only the most contracted level or most contracted point of the of the past, and so this shows in the fact that even physically, the notion of a purely instantaneous event doesn't make sense. The action takes time. So this is one of the main, I take philosophical lessons of quantum mechanics, is that there is a Planck limit to the time it takes for anything to happen in the physical sense, meaning the physical notion of action. And so this, I think, is an indication that at the basic level, the present doesn't exist as an instantaneous cut or slice. What exists is the past. So you could drop the present altogether. In that sense, Bergson is by no means a presentist. It's much more complex than that. The presentist view that the moving spotlight is utterly misguided if you think that this describes the basic ontological process.
Okay, thank you very much.
A few elements, sorry.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from Professor Hall.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has been very enlightening, and it's I'm here in Texas in America, but your last comments there really struck me to compare with the work of Jean Gebsner, The Ever-Present Origin. I'm wondering if that, I'm trying to hang these things together here, but again, thank you very much. I have to sit and read my notes, but it's good to meet you. Yes.
Gebsner, I have to tell you, I have the book somewhere. I bought it.
The Ever-Present Origin.
Yeah, I have it here, and didn't take the time to read it yet, but I could sense the reason why I bought it is I could sense there is an affinity and a connection at some point, and it comes back to the question you asked yesterday about synchronicity. So it's one thing to talk about simultaneity and the way it's generally introduced from a physical perspective involves, well, the possibility of continuous action or communication, using signaling devices, sending light or any electromagnetic signal out there, getting an answer or response, and then kind of calculating or symbolically ascribing a point out there, an event which we take to be, under a certain perspective, simultaneous with what's happening now or what was happening then. Synchronicity, the way I understand it, is directly introduced as an acausal or non-causal relation. So there is an affinity with the way simultaneity ultimately is understood in physics. It is actual simultaneity, distant simultaneity involves that the two simultaneous events cannot communicate. There is no possible causal connections because, to put it briefly, they are too far apart in space and too close in time for a path of light or any electromagnetic signal to connect them causally. But this comes as a kind of a derivative notion. The first thing that a physicist will do is introduce a sense of a device which enables things to actually communicate. And so by implication, they will define simultaneity as something in between, in the interval where those events which are truly simultaneous in an objective sense cannot communicate. But it comes as the obverse or the negative image of something which is very familiar, which is the possibility of communicating at a distance by exchanging signals and so on. What I'm interested in Jung and others who have grappled with the notion of synchronicity is that what is primary is the sense that is this non-communication, this kind of, or let's say
telepathic,
non-causal communication, which is nevertheless a relation, a proper and genuine relation. It's a relation that is defined from the outset, directly defined as non-causal, or as a measure of the separation between things. But it's a separation which allows for other layers of other type of relation to emerge, such as meaning relations or analogies.
The meaningful coincidence,
right?
And how that. And so perhaps also the way with your toolkit might be to go through Pauli and Jung and look at that conversation in terms of synchronicity, and which, Gebsner mirrors. But this is brilliant, brilliant work. I, as I say, 72 hours ago, I didn't know any of you existed. And so this is so wonderful to find a new community on time like this. So thank you much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any questions, so I will allow myself to ask one.
Right.
You said about the ways we should talk about time other than, let's say, analytical way. And one of the manners in which we can say about time, you said we need to look at Bergson's intuition. But you also said that it is not the only one, and I wanted to ask, what would you suggest?
I mean, any of those I mentioned actually should be considered as a priori as a valid resource. So could be Plato, Aristotle, any of those. Now, in the contemporary context, in the context of contemporary, let's say 20th and 21st century thought. Yeah, of course, you could reclaim certain ideas by Plato or Aristotle, but so it would be a bit awkward because the context is so different and the science is so different that it seems that like an artificial maneuver, and I think more relevant are those authors which are contemporary, as Bergson was, of the the most important scientific revolutions of the 20th century. And so, but they need not be entirely aware of the details or even particularly interested in contemporary science. So I'm thinking random wild association. I'm thinking of someone like Sartre on the extreme opposite of the spectrum, someone who I think never took the time to really, get a minimal grasp of scientific context of concepts, and who almost exclusively related to science secondhand, through others. He nevertheless developed quite an interesting conceptual analysis of simultaneity at a distance based on a very, very roots, very old school example, which is epistolary exchanges, sending out a letter. So especially in the time of war, writing in his diaries of a phony war, he speaks of his ongoing exchange with Simone de Beauvoir. So sending out a letter which may take 3 weeks to get to her, then awaiting an answer. And so he describes, so phenomenologically, basically, without any reference to contemporary science, what kind of temporal experience and what kind of concepts can be organized in the interval between sending and receiving. And the sense of simultaneity as being the experience of separation as such, the way it carves out, he described it as carving out of the relational space, social space, where we think we're interacting with people, but in fact we're experiencing a continuous sense of separation, which amounts in his particular example to a kind of transcendental jealousy, where you're worried not so much about what particular person the other is seeing right now, but you're concerned that there is no way you can know anything about what is happening right now anywhere, at least at the moment I'm speaking, and so on and so forth. There are resources out there to actually come to a very, very rich and detailed, fine-grained analysis of the experience of simultaneity at a distance. Totally unrelated in Sartre's view to contemporary science, but the connections are there. And so in between, the middle portion of the spectrum, you'd have someone like Bachelard, who's kind of course, strongly involved with the contemporary science, but not really interested in doing metaphysics in the traditional sense, and perhaps more interested in what is going on in the literary avant-garde and poetry and the work of material imagination. Nevertheless, there is also this way of dealing with contemporary science, which is meant to extract new ideas, new intuitions, which can somehow, at some level, resonate with a phenomenological experience. Not in the kind of common sense, straightforward way where science is more or less making things more precise and at some point forcing us to abandon certain common sense notions such as absolute time, but a connection where science is not there to actually rectify common sense, but to intensify what in common experience appears to us as the most intriguing, maybe the potentially most interesting dimensions of lived time. So in Bachelard, you'd find, for example, in a book I just worked on, there's a new critical edition of that book, Dialectic of Durations, 1936 book, which I highly recommend, not only because I've worked on the edition, but there is a very far-reaching reflection on the psychological, artistic, potentially artistic, but also scientific implications of a non-continuous time, a time which does not unfold continuously, according to the scheme described by Bergson, continuous accumulation of the past, but which comes in drops, or which is eruptive in nature. So, and which is interspersed with the intervals of what? Not exactly lack in the psychoanalytic sense, but absence, or described functionally non-activity. So a function is active, and then at some point either it breaks down or it's suspended and it's inactive for a while. And so the challenge is to recover a sense of duration without assuming that the moments, the phases of becoming are continuously linked. There are gaps. It's a gappy and chunky time, which is nevertheless able to capable of yielding a sense of duration, of ongoing duration. So these are examples that I've come across recently, and they have various degrees of connection with actual science, but they're all relevant because I think the problems are common to science, common sense, and metaphysics. I think we should start and work from the assumption that there are common issues, common problems, and not start by introducing dividing lines between what subjective time, human time, scientific time, and so on and so forth. That's not the way it works for us. It may work like this for working scientists, but working scientists at some point become philosophers when they have time. That was my point. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us.